What was happening in America in November of 1926 that suggested that bank robbery was as accepted as, say, Thanksgiving dinner? Armistice Day, the remembrance of the end of World War I, was definitely front and center. But November 1926 will turn out to see even more violence, death, and greed. First, we'll take a look at the culture and conditions of the American people, the ubiquitousness of bank robbery, and then we'll follow up with a dash of good news in Part 1 of November 1926, Decades of History. Welcome to Decades of History, where we cover safecrackers and bank heists from 1926 up until U.S. involvement in World War II. First up, we turn to the Brownsville Herald, the November 11, 1926 edition, where we see a bank ad for the First National Bank of Brownsville, Texas. Incidentally, the bank was known as the Friendly Bank, and it touted the safety and reliability of the bank. They noted that, quote, "it doesn't pay to experiment," end quote, and asked, why take chances? Seemed like bank failures and bank robberies were on the American consumer's mind. Next up, we turn to the Evening Star, the paper out of Washington, D.C., and also a November 11, 1926 edition. Let's turn a negative story into a positive one. Titled, "Thief Makes Safe Lock," comes via the AP, the Associated Press, from north of the border in Canada. Apparently, one Norman "Red" Ryan, considered a notorious bandit, was serving a life term in the Portsmouth Penitentiary for bank robbery. Not wasting his life away, Ryan invented a theft-proof lock for mailbags. Its creation supposedly would lead to eliminating the need for ropes, straps, or steel bars, while not sacrificing the integrity and security of the bag. Its creation would lighten the weight of the bag as well. A patent was to be taken out in his name and held at the Canadian Patent Office. Additional research led me to the Canadian Online Encyclopedia, where I learned that Norman "Red" Ryan was nicknamed Canada's Jesse James. He had committed numerous robberies in Ontario, Quebec, and in the United States. He deserted the Canadian Army in World War I, and once even made a spectacular escape from the Kingston Penitentiary. Back in 1923, he was captured by American police, deported to Canada, and sentenced to life imprisonment, where he became a model prisoner, impressing officials with his exemplary behavior. His story attracted the attention of journalists and others who wrote positive stories about him, of his criminal career, but also what the encyclopedia said were sympathetic accounts, touting again his apparent rehabilitation. He was supported by important people, including the Prime Minister and an MP, and was paroled in July of 1935. It's a big switch from a life sentence. For 10 months, he presented himself publicly as an honest spokesman for prison reform, while apparently secretly he was reestablishing underworld contacts. He ended up being killed in a shootout with police after an attempted robbery. There are at least 2 books, The Golden Boy of Crime by Jim Brown and The Big Red Fox by Peter McSherry. There are tons of newspaper articles from the Toronto Daily Star and a paper, The Globe or the Globe and Mail. I'm not sure if those are 1 or 2 papers. I'll add links for the Canadian Encyclopedia and Wikipedia links as well in the description. The Kennebec County Times, November 4, 1926 edition. It was a paper out of Moore, Minnesota, and it ran a page of county news items. Under a section titled "The City's Echo," it was noted, I think tongue-in-cheek and sarcastically, with a tinge of seriousness, that, quote, "Brunswick is taking on more and more the appearance of a large city. Bank robberies and everything," end quote. And lastly, we turn to the Producers News, their November 5, 1926 edition. The In the Limelight section of the Producers News brought the crime wave into focus. Moreover, the conclusion of the article, or probably more appropriately, the editorial, aligns with one of my theses for this channel. To wit, World War I veterans returned home having learned skills that weren't necessarily applicable to peacetime civilian living. In addition, they came home to an economy and a culture that was on the precipice of crashing. This is why an unknown number turned to bank robbery and gangsterdom, and why I'm tracking World War I veterans for these crimes, whether or not they were World War I veterans. The article noted that Chicago was used to machine gun battles between gangs fighting over territory like an organized army. But as we've seen over this year of videos, that Chicago wasn't the only place. In fact, throughout the country, bank heists and violence were a regular occurrence. The article noted North Dakota having experienced several bank and store robberies, and that Montana had seen thefts and bank heists. Oil station robberies and stick-ups were occurring, and we're going to hit on actually the North Dakota and Montana angle in parts 2 and 3 of November 1926 videos. Not unlike today, it was noted that police could only be in one place at a time, and so most of the time the criminals escaped. The writer implored citizens to carry their own sidearms, ready to defend their homes if necessary. The crux, though, was that the writer concluded that young men shipped off to war and returned having learned how to shoot, in some cases how to kill, and lived kind of ensconced in a world of violence. Quote, "Society did not treat these boys as it promised after the war. The result is that some of them are getting back at society." Crime was clearly on people's minds in the Roaring '20s, with, as we've seen, banks touting security, people almost reacting ho-hum to bank heists and other violent crimes in towns and cities, but also even out in rural areas. This is just more fodder demonstrating that American culture and the economy was faltering. Thankfully, there is one bright light in an otherwise fairly dismal November 1926, and for that we turn to the November 5, 1926 Evening Star, which ran an innocuously titled story, An Unusual Ending, which serves as our only follow-up for the month of November. It turns out that one of our October 1926 quick hitter stories about a foiled Bank of Detroit heist ended up with a happy ending. I'll add a link, incidentally, to that video at the end of this one. Recall that 3 robbers entered the Bank of Detroit when a hidden guard opened fire without warning. The 3 robbers fled, but ran smack dab into 2 patrolmen, William Gadd, G-A-D-D-E, and Frank Dombecki. A firefight ensued, during which one robber, who turned out to be a former police officer, was shot and ended up dying on the pavement. Another robber was clipped in the leg, but escaped in the getaway car. And Dombecki, Patrolman Dombecki, was, quote, severely injured. Our update noted that Dombecki had been hit 3 times, but while leaning against the bank door for support, Dombecki was able to fire on the criminals. Well, the update was that he was, quote, not seriously injured and was actually expected to return to his police beat in no time. The writer admonished the robbers for daring to mess around in Dombecki's territory since just last September, September 1925 that is, he'd shot and killed a man who'd just slain his partner named Frank Marcinkowski. This was during a series of riots that were taking place in Detroit. the writer suggested that Don Becky should receive some sort of promotion and reward for his efforts. Great news to hear was that Don Becky recovered, and incidentally, his fame and notoriety, at least for a short period, was actually nationwide. I've added a few links. The first two are specifically about Don Becky, and the third includes period video clips of Detroit, which are actually not specific to Don Becky, but are very, very cool to see. So in part one, we just saw that the American people were attuned to bank heists and a violent atmosphere. But thankfully, sometimes good guys don't finish last. Part 2 will cover some of our new quick hitter stories, which will take us on a spree of crime and killing in North Dakota and Montana, and then to a sad and silly attempted heist in Miami, Florida. For now, I want to thank you for spending your time with Decades of History. Until next time.
Where somebody waits for me, sugar sweet, and so is she. Bye.